Every single time you fly, something happens that almost no one notices. You're sitting in your seat, the plane starts moving, and at some point during the takeoff roll, you feel this subtle change, a slight shift in the noise, a barely perceptible change in how the plane feels underneath you. And then you're in the air, and you don't think twice about it. What actually just happened is one of the most precisely engineered sequences in all of transportation. In roughly 30 seconds, a machine weighing up to 1,000,000 pounds accelerated to nearly 200 miles per hour and defied gravity. And the reason it works, the actual physics of why that metal tube didn't just stay on the ground, is almost nothing like what most people think. Because most people think planes fly because of something called Bernoulli's principle. You've probably heard this. Air travels faster over the curved top of the wing, pressure drops, suction pulls the plane up. It's in every textbook. It's what your science teacher told you. And it's not wrong, exactly. But it's massively incomplete, and the part it leaves out is the part that actually explains most of what's keeping you in the air. This is plainly put. Let's talk about how planes actually fly. All right, let's start with Bernoulli, because we have to address it properly before we can move past it. Bernoulli's principle is real physics. It correctly describes the relationship between fluid speed and pressure. When a fluid, including air, moves faster, its pressure drops, and the top surface of a wing is curved, called the camber. So air moving over the top does travel a slightly longer path than air moving under the bottom, so pressure is slightly lower on top. That's all true. The problem is the explanation that gets taught alongside it, that the air molecules going over the top have to meet up with the molecules going under the bottom at the trailing edge at the same time. So the top air has to go faster to cover more distance. That part is wrong. It's a misconception that somehow made it into textbooks and has never really left. Air molecules don't have a reunion appointment at the back of the wing. The ones going over the top actually arrive at the trailing edge significantly earlier. The speed difference is real, but the reason for it isn't that equal time story. So what's actually creating lift? The bigger, more important answer is Newton's third law. A wing is angled slightly upward relative to the direction of travel. That angle is called the angle of attack. At that angle, the wing deflects air downward. Not just a little, a lot. An airliner in cruise is continuously throwing a river of air downward, and by Newton's third law, that river of air pushes the plane upward with equal and opposite force. That's the main event. The wing is essentially a machine for redirecting airflow downward, and the reaction to that redirection is what keeps a 900,000-pound aircraft in the air. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The angle of attack is everything. Tilt the wing up more, you deflect more air downward, you get more lift. But there's a limit. Increase the angle of attack too far, and something called a stall happens. Not a stall like an engine dying, but an aerodynamic stall. The airflow over the top of the wing separates from the surface instead of following it smoothly. Lift drops dramatically. The nose pitches down. This is one of the most dangerous situations in aviation, and also one of the most counterintuitive, because the natural instinct when a plane is falling is to pull the nose up, which is exactly the wrong thing to do in a stall, because pulling up increases the angle of attack and makes the stall worse. The correct recovery is to push the nose down, which feels horrifying, but it reduces the angle of attack, reattaches the airflow, and restores lift. Pilots train for stalls constantly because of exactly this counterintuitive reflex problem. Your brain says pull up, physics says push down. Every pilot has to override their survival instinct until that push-down response is automatic. Let's talk about something you've definitely noticed, but probably never thought about: the flaps. When a plane is on final approach to land, those panels on the back of the wings extend and droop downward, completely changing the wing's shape. What's happening there is actually a temporary redesign of the wing in flight. In cruise, the wing is optimized for efficiency at high speed, relatively thin, clean profile, producing lift with minimum drag. But for takeoff and landing, the plane needs to fly much slower, and a high-speed wing profile doesn't generate enough lift at low speed to stay airborne. so the flaps extend, increasing the wing's camber and its surface area, which increases lift at low speeds. The trade-off is dramatically increased drag, which, for landing, is exactly what you want. You need to slow down. The flaps help you bleed off speed while still maintaining enough lift to land gently rather than fall out of the sky. Slats work on the same principle at the leading edge of the wing. If you look out the window during takeoff and watch the front of the wing, you'll often see panels slide forward and droop at the nose. Those are the leading edge slats, and they're doing a version of the same job, improving low-speed performance by changing the shape of the wing's front edge. Here's the thing about all of this that most people never stop to appreciate. The wing you see on a plane is not one wing. It's a reconfigurable system that transforms its own shape multiple times during every single flight. On the ground, retracted, clean. During takeoff, flaps and slats extended. In cruise, fully retracted and optimized. On approach, partially extended. On landing, fully extended, and additionally spoilers deploying on top of the wing to deliberately destroy, lift, and help push the plane onto the runway. That wing is doing completely different jobs at different phases of flight, and the engineers who designed every position and the software that sequences every deployment spent years getting those numbers exactly right. Now, let's go somewhere most people never think about. The vertical tail. That big fin at the back of the plane isn't decoration. It's doing something critical. When you fly, the plane doesn't always point in the same direction it's moving. Crosswinds push the nose sideways. Engine thrust imbalances, especially significant if an engine fails, try to yaw the plane off course. The vertical tail acts like a weather vane, with a movable section called the rudder, which the pilots use to counteract those yawing forces and keep the plane pointed where it needs to go. In normal cruise, it's barely active, but on landing in a crosswind, the rudder is working hard, holding the nose at an angle to the runway called a crab right up until touchdown, at which point, the pilot makes a precise rudder input called a kick to align the aircraft before the main gear touches down. It's one of the most skill-intensive moments in routine commercial flying, and most passengers are completely unaware it's happening. The last thing I want to talk about is something that reveals just how much engineering goes into keeping you comfortable inside an aluminum tube at 35,000 feet, pressurization. At cruise altitude, the air outside the plane is so thin you'd lose consciousness in about a minute if you breathed it directly. So the plane takes air in through the engines, compresses it, cools it, and pumps it into the cabin at a pressure equivalent to roughly 6,000 to 8,000 feet of altitude. Not sea level pressure, because maintaining true sea level pressure would stress the airframe too much over time, but enough that your body handles it fine. That air circulates through the cabin and bleeds out through outflow valves, usually a pair at the back of the fuselage at a controlled rate that maintains the cabin pressure without either overpressurizing or underpressurizing the aircraft. The reason airplane cabins are so dry, uncomfortably dry, skin cracking, lip chapping dry, is a side effect of this system. That compressed engine air has almost zero humidity. The plane doesn't add moisture back in because the weight of the water required would be significant, and any moisture inside the cabin that found its way into the airframe structure could cause corrosion. So the trade-off is a humidity level that sometimes drops below 10% drier than most deserts. You're not imagining the headache in the dry throat. The air really is that dehydrated. Drink your water. When you watch a plane land and those wheels touch down with a puff of smoke, what you're seeing is rubber spinning up from 0 to around 150 miles per hour in a fraction of a second. The tires aren't burning. That's tire rubber being abraded off as angular momentum catches up with linear momentum. An airliner's main gear tires are built to survive that impact thousands of times before replacement. Inflated to about 200 pounds per square inches, roughly 6 times a car tire to handle a load that, on a heavy landing, can exceed 1,000,000 pounds per square inch. Briefly, at the contact patch. A plane is not a simple machine with one trick. It's a system of systems, every one of them solving a physics problem you've never had to think about, working together so seamlessly that flying feels boring, which when you think about what's actually happening, is the most impressive engineering achievement of all. And that, plainly put, is how your plane stays in the air. If this made your next flight a little more interesting and maybe a little more nerve-wracking, subscribe to Plainly Put. New video every week. See you next Tuesday.